The thunderstorm caught me by surprise as I drove home from my usual Saturday golf game. It was supposed to be a relaxing day, but the storm forced me to turn back earlier than expected. What I wasn't prepared for was the storm brewing inside my house. When I opened the door, the scene that greeted me shattered everything. There on the couch, my wife Deborah and her boss Edward were entangled in a semi-clothed embrace. I stood frozen, my mind racing, heart pounding. In that moment, my world collapsed. I had trusted her, loved her, but now betrayal was staring me right in the face. My name's Cole Humphrey, and I'm 39 years old. I'm 6 feet tall, with brown hair that's starting to gray at the edges, and a lean frame that comes more from stress and long hours than from exercise. I've always prided myself on being rational, the type of person who keeps calm under pressure. I work as a lawyer, handling tough divorce cases, and I'm good at it. But nothing could have prepared me for the way my own marriage would unravel right in front of me. Deborah, my wife, is 36 years old. She's beautiful, with striking auburn hair that falls in soft waves and green eyes that once sparkled with life and energy. She's always been the center of attention in any room she walks into, full of charm and laughter. I thought we had a good life together. We didn't have any kids, by mutual decision. I had wanted children for some time, but Deborah wasn't ready. I tried to respect that, though a part of me always wondered if that was one of the reasons we started to drift apart. We met 8 years ago at a mutual friend's wedding. I was 31, having just made partner at the law firm where I worked, and Deborah was 28, working her way up in the marketing field. She was the maid of honor at the wedding, and I was immediately drawn to her. She was vivacious, full of life, and exactly what I needed at that time. We clicked instantly. Our relationship moved quickly after that, and within 2 years, we were married. It was a good match, or so I thought. I loved her deeply, and for a while, I believed she loved me the same way. For the first few years, our marriage was solid. We enjoyed traveling, going out to fancy dinners, and just spending time together. But then things started to change. Deborah got a new job working for Edward Clapton, and everything seemed to shift. Edward was her boss, and from what I could see, they had a good working relationship. At least, that's what I told myself whenever I felt uneasy about how often his name came up in conversations. Deborah stopped joining me for my Saturday morning golf games about a year ago. At first, she said she had other things to do, that she was busy with work or errands. I didn't think much of it. She's always been independent, and I respected that. But as time went on, the distance between us grew. She'd come home later and later from work, always with an excuse. Late meetings, last-minute projects. I noticed her texting more often, usually late at night. When I asked her about it, she brushed it off, saying it was just work-related. I trusted her, or maybe I just didn't want to face the truth. There were other small signs. She started dressing up more for work, putting in extra effort that she hadn't in a while. I'd catch her smiling at her phone when she thought I wasn't looking. It was easy to ignore those things, to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. After all, I was busy too. My law practice kept me occupied most days, and when I wasn't working, I tried to stay fit by playing golf. We had our separate lives, and I thought that was normal. But the reality of what was happening hit me like a ton of bricks that Saturday afternoon. The rain had forced me to cut my golf game short, and I drove home, expecting to find Deborah doing her usual weekend chores. Instead, I found her on the couch, wrapped around Edward. They were half-dressed, lost in each other, oblivious to the fact that I had just walked in. I stood there, frozen, unable to process what I was seeing. My wife, my Deborah, was with another man, her boss, no less. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually, they noticed me. Edward scrambled to pull his shirt back on, avoiding my gaze as he made a beeline for the door. Deborah, on the other hand, just stood there, her eyes wide with shock, her hands trembling. I wanted to scream, to yell, to demand answers, but instead all I could manage was a cold, detached statement. Get out. It was as if the words weren't coming from me, but from some other part of myself that had already checked out emotionally. I told Edward to leave, and he didn't hesitate. He bolted out the door like the coward he was, leaving Deborah and me alone in the suffocating silence. Deborah looked at me, her eyes filling with tears. "Can't we talk?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, I don't have anywhere to go." But I didn't care. I was numb. the betrayal too deep to allow for any sort of reconciliation in that moment. "You can go wherever he goes," I replied, my voice cold and flat. "I'll pack your things and put them in the garage. I'll call you when you can come pick them up." She looked devastated, and for a moment I almost felt bad. But then the image of her wrapped around Edward flashed through my mind again, and the anger surged back. I couldn't forgive her. Not now. Maybe not ever. As Deborah packed a small bag, I stood in the hallway watching her, feeling a strange mix of emotions: rage, sorrow, and disbelief. How had it come to this? How had the woman I loved betrayed me so completely? I didn't have any answers, only a deep, hollow ache where my heart used to be. Once she was gone, I picked up my phone and called Edward's wife, Betty Clapton. I'd met her once or twice at work functions, though we weren't close. When she answered, her voice sounded tired, as if she already knew what I was about to tell her. "Mrs. Clapton," I said, "this is Cole Humphrey. I think we need to talk." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then she sighed. "My husband and your wife," she said quietly. "I've suspected it for a while. I found your number in his phone records. I wanted to believe it was just work, but there were too many late-night calls, too many lies." She paused. "I'll call you back after I talk to him." He just pulled into the driveway. I spent the next hour pacing the house, torn between rage and despair. How could Deborah do this to me? How long had this been going on? I thought about all the moments I had brushed off, all the signs I had ignored. I was a fool, blinded by my own love and trust in her. When Betty called back, she sounded as miserable as I felt. "It's true," she said simply. "They've been seeing each other for months. I'm meeting with a lawyer first thing Monday. This marriage is over." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, but they also brought a strange sense of relief. At least I wasn't alone in this nightmare. Betty and I agreed to meet the next day, to share whatever information we had. There was no going back now. Both of our marriages were shattered beyond repair. Betrayal and discovery. The next day, I met Betty Clapton for lunch. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I figured we could at least share some details. Maybe help each other figure out how long our spouses had been lying to us. When she walked into the restaurant, I was stunned. Betty was heavily pregnant, at least 8 months along. My heart sank even further as I realized just how deep this betrayal ran. Edward hadn't just cheated on his wife, he had cheated on his pregnant wife. As she sat down, I could see the weariness in her eyes, a kind of sadness that mirrored my own. We exchanged a few pleasantries, but it wasn't long before the conversation turned to our cheating spouses. "I can't believe it," I said, my voice laced with frustration. "I walked in on them yesterday. If I hadn't left my golf bag in the car, I might have beaten them both to death right there." Betty looked up at me, a flicker of amusement in her eyes despite the pain. "Well, that would have solved my problem," she said, "but you'd have a whole new set of issues on your hands." I shook my head, the image of Deborah and Edward together still fresh in my mind. "I'm a lawyer, for God's sake. I should have seen this coming." Betty nodded, her hands absent-mindedly resting on her swollen belly. "I had my suspicions for months. Edward kept telling me it was work, that the late nights were for some project. But deep down, I knew." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of our mutual betrayal hanging in the air. I couldn't help but feel a strange kinship with Betty, like we were both soldiers in the same war, battling the same enemies. She pulled a sheaf of papers from her purse and handed them to me. "I went through Edward's phone records," she said quietly. "Your wife's number shows up more times than I can count. They'd been talking for months. He tried to tell me it was all work-related, but I wasn't buying it." I took the papers from her, my stomach turning as I scanned the list of calls and texts between Edward and Deborah. It was undeniable. They'd been carrying on behind our backs for months, and we were the last to know. As we talked, Betty's calm demeanor started to crack. "I'm due any day now," she said, her voice shaking. "Edward was supposed to help me get ready for the baby, but instead, he's been off with your wife. Half the time I want to castrate him, and the other half I'm so sad I can hardly move." I nodded, the anger bubbling up again. "I should have beaten them both to death with a golf club," I muttered, half joking, though part of me wasn't kidding at all. Betty gave me a small, sad smile. "That might have solved my problem, but it would have landed you in jail. At least now we can work together to get through this." We spent the next hour discussing our next steps. Betty was ready to file for divorce, and I wasn't far behind. We talked strategy, and I offered her some legal advice, basic stuff about filing for divorce, dividing assets, and protecting herself financially. But it was clear she didn't need much help. Betty was sharp, and despite the mess Edward had created, she was determined to come out of this on top. After lunch, Betty came back to my house, and together, we began going through Deborah's emails. I hadn't even opened her account since the night before, but I knew what I'd find. Evidence of the affair, plain and simple. Sure enough, there it was, email after email between Deborah and Edward, filled with flirtation and innuendo. I hadn't read through all of them yet, but the few I skimmed were enough to make my blood boil. As Betty scrolled through more of the emails, she suddenly gasped. "Look at this," she said, pointing at the screen. My eyes followed her finger, and there it was, videos. Dozens of them. "They made videos," Betty said, her voice tight with anger. "They actually recorded themselves." The rage I had been trying to keep under control surged again. How could Deborah have done this? How could she have betrayed me so completely and then had the audacity to record it? Betty found a blank CD and quickly burned copies of the videos. As I stood there watching her work, my phone rang. It was Deborah. I couldn't even bring myself to speak to her, so I handed the phone to Betty. "You want to say something to her?" I asked, barely containing my anger. Betty nodded and took the phone, her voice low and steady as she spoke. "You're a pretty low-life bitch," she said. "I'm a week away from having a baby, and you're screwing my husband. Well, guess what? You can have him. When Cole and I are done packing up all of Edward's stuff, we'll be heading to your house to pack yours too. You can pick it up from the curb, you degenerate." I couldn't help but smile at her sharpness. Betty wasn't holding back, and I admired that about her. She handed the phone back to me, and I could hear Deborah's voice on the other end, pleading, trying to explain herself. "I changed the alarm code already," I said flatly. "You can come by and pick up your things whenever you want. I'll leave them on the porch. You'll find the computer there too, the one you asked about." Deborah's response was weak, but I wasn't interested in hearing it. I hung up before she could say anything more. As Betty and I continued going through the files, she suddenly stopped and turned to me. "We need to be careful," she said quietly. "They've proven they can lie. I wouldn't put it past them to start watching us, maybe even try to twist this around." Her words made me pause. She was right. Deborah and Edward weren't the only guilty parties anymore. If they found out that Betty and I were spending time together, they could easily try to turn the tables on us, make us out to be the bad guys. I'd seen it happen in court cases before, and I didn't want it happening to us. But Betty wasn't worried. "Let's just get through this," she said, her determination clear. "We've got a plan, and we'll see it through." The next morning, Betty and I went to the bank. We opened new accounts and transferred most of the money from our joint accounts into savings. It was a smart move, one that would protect us in case Deborah or Edward tried to take us for everything we had. I'd seen it happen too many times in my line of work, not this time. As we were leaving the bank, the manager informed us that someone had already tried to access the accounts from another branch. Edward, most likely. He was probably furious that most of the money was gone, but I didn't care. He should have acted faster. After that, we headed to the courthouse to file our divorce papers. It was a surreal experience, standing there with Betty, both of us filing complaints against our cheating spouses. We paid the filing fee, hired a constable to serve the papers, and walked out of the courthouse with a sense of grim satisfaction. We spent the rest of the day together, stopping by Lowe's to pick out paint for the baby's room. Betty was determined to keep moving forward, even though I could tell she was exhausted from the weight of everything. As we drove back to her house, I couldn't help but admire her strength. She was due to have a baby any day now, but she wasn't letting that slow her down. Later that night, I dropped Betty off at her house. The rain was pouring again, just like the day I had discovered Deborah and Edward's affair. As I helped Betty inside, she looked at me, her expression serious. "We need to be careful," she said again. "They're not the bad guys here. We are. They'll try to spin this, and we need to stay ahead of them." I nodded, understanding the weight of what she was saying. We were playing a dangerous game, one that could easily turn against us if we weren't careful. The following days were a whirlwind. I spent most of my time helping Betty prepare for the baby, painting the nursery, putting together furniture, and trying to keep her spirits up. She was handling everything better than I expected. But I knew the stress was taking its toll. Edward had been calling her, trying to talk his way back into her life. But Betty wasn't having any of it. Meanwhile, Deborah kept trying to reach me too, leaving voicemails and sending texts, all of which I ignored. I had nothing left to say to her. The papers had been filed, and I was ready to move on. A few days later, I found myself standing on the porch with Deborah's computer in my arms, just like I had promised. It was 6:30 in the morning, earlier than I had planned, but I wanted to get it over with. As I opened the door, I came face to face with Deborah. "You served the divorce papers at work?" she said, her voice filled with disbelief. That was humiliating. I shrugged, my heart hardened by everything that had happened. "I didn't have your address," I said simply. It was the only way. She looked at me, tears filling her eyes. "I talked to a lawyer. You're wrong. We never committed adultery. What you saw was just a mistake. We kissed, we touched, but we never had sex. It doesn't meet the legal definition of adultery." I smiled bitterly. "So you never had sex with Edward?" "Not once?" She shook her head vigorously. "Never. It was the first time, and it didn't go that far." I didn't believe her. I couldn't. "I'll take it under consideration," I said coldly, closing the door behind me as she stood on the porch, her pleas unanswered. Revenge time. After that final conversation with Deborah, I was done pretending. She could spin her lies about what did or didn't happen with Edward all she wanted, but I knew the truth. I had seen it, felt it in the pit of my stomach the moment I walked in on them. Now, it was time to focus on getting back at them in the only way that mattered, by hitting them where it hurt most. The following week, I threw myself into helping Betty with the final preparations for the baby. It was a welcome distraction from the mess of my marriage and the looming divorce battle. Betty and I were getting closer by the day, bound by our shared betrayal and the sense that we were in this fight together. One Friday night, just after midnight, I got the call I had been expecting. Betty was in labor. I had moved to an apartment complex not far from her house, so I arrived in less than 10 minutes. We had practiced this a dozen times, rehearsed what to do when the baby finally decided to come, but nothing could prepare us for the real thing. It was chaos, pure and simple. The next few hours were a blur. I stayed by Betty's side, holding her hand, whispering words of encouragement, though I had no idea what I was doing. When the doctor offered me the chance to cut the umbilical cord, I politely declined, but I did hold the baby afterward, wrapped in a tiny blanket, still red and squirming. Betty named her Emily, and in that moment I realized I had become part of something much bigger than the revenge I had been planning. After Emily's birth, things moved quickly. Betty and I spent more and more time together, and I became something of an unofficial babysitter for Emily while Betty worked from home. She trusted me with her daughter, which felt like a huge responsibility. I would spend hours holding the baby while Betty took breaks to breastfeed or catch up on work, and in those moments, the anger and pain I had been carrying around seemed to fade. Emily was a beautiful baby, and I was happy to help Betty, even if it meant setting aside my own issues for a while. Of course, Deborah and Edward hadn't disappeared from our lives. Their lawyers kept filing counterclaims, accusing Betty and me of having an affair. It was ridiculous, but we had no choice but to defend ourselves against the accusations. Edward tried to visit Emily a few times, calling Betty to arrange visits, but she always asked me to be there when he came over. I think she felt safer that way, knowing that I was there to support her and make sure Edward didn't pull any tricks. Deborah, on the other hand, called me constantly, trying to squeeze more money out of me or asking for help with mundane things like turning on the furnace. I ignored most of her calls, deleting her voicemails without listening to them. I didn't have the patience for her manipulations anymore. The depositions for our divorce cases were a joke. Deborah's attorney was young, barely out of law school, and he had no idea what he was doing. My lawyer, on the other hand, was a seasoned professional, a ball-buster who took no prisoners. She ate lawyers like Deborah's for breakfast. As soon as I sat down for my deposition, Deborah's lawyer tried to accuse me of infidelity, claiming that I had been having an affair with Betty before Deborah and I separated. It was laughable. I've never had a sexual relationship with Betty, I said flatly. Not before June 3rd, not after. I met her for the first time on June 4th, and at the time she was 9 months pregnant. We've never been anything more than friends. Deborah's lawyer blushed, clearly embarrassed by his own line of questioning, but he pressed on. We have photos of you leaving her house, he said, trying to sound confident. We know you've been seeing each other. I felt my anger rising, but I kept it under control. We've been friends, nothing more, I said calmly. If you're trying to build a case for adultery, you're going to have to do better than that. My lawyer chimed in at that point, her voice smooth and confident. My client handles dozens of divorces every month, she said. He knows the legal definition of adultery better than you do, and he recognizes it when he sees it. This line of questioning is a waste of time. Deborah's lawyer, now fully flustered, backed down, and the rest of the deposition went by in a blur of legal jargon and formalities. When it was over, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. Deborah had been lying to me for months, maybe years, but now the tables were turning. We had the upper hand, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came out in court. The weeks leading up to the court date were a whirlwind. I spent most of my time with Betty and Emily, helping out wherever I could and trying to keep my mind off the impending trial. I had moved to a new apartment just a few minutes from Betty's house, and we had fallen into a comfortable routine. I would watch Emily while Betty went to the gym, and afterward we would have dinner together, talk about our days, and occasionally share a bottle of wine. Betty and I had grown close, but it wasn't romantic. Not yet. We were like two soldiers who had been through the same war, supporting each other, but not crossing the line into something more. I could tell she wasn't ready for that, and neither was I. We had both been burned too badly by our marriages, and we were taking things slow. As the court date approached, Betty and I spent hours going over the details of our cases, preparing for the inevitable showdown with Deborah and Edward. We knew they would lie, that they would try to paint us as the villains in their twisted story, but we had the truth on our side, and we had something even more powerful: those videos. The day of the trial finally arrived, and I'll never forget the feeling of walking into that courtroom. Deborah and Edward were there, sitting with their lawyers, looking smug and confident. They still thought they could win, that they could somehow turn this around and come out on top. But they didn't know what we had. Deborah's lawyer made his case first, trying to argue that I had been unfaithful, that I had started a relationship with Betty before our separation. He presented photos of me leaving Betty's house, of us spending time together, but there was no substance to his argument. It was all circumstantial, and my lawyer tore it apart with ease. When it was our turn, my lawyer called our surprise witness, Detective Lieutenant Bill Acosta. Deborah's lawyer objected, of course, but the judge allowed it. Acosta took the stand, and my lawyer began her questioning. "Detective Acosta, do you know my client, Mr. Humphrey?" she asked. Acosta, glaring at me with clear disdain, replied, "Unfortunately, yes, I don't like him. He represented my ex-wife in our divorce, and he's a scumbag divorce attorney, but that has nothing to do with this case." My lawyer nodded, unfazed. "Can you tell the court what Mr. Humphrey left in your possession on June 5th? Acosta pulled a CD from his jacket, holding it up for the court to see. "This. A compact disc that he asked me to hold on to as evidence. Do you know what's on the disc?" My lawyer asked. Acosta shook his head. "I never watched it. It's been sealed in my office safe since the day he gave it to me." My lawyer offered the CD as evidence, asking the judge to review its contents privately. As she did, I glanced over at Deborah and Edward. Their faces were pale, their smug expressions gone. They knew what was on that disc, and they knew their time was up. The judge took a recess to review the video, and when she returned, her expression was grim. "Miss Grant," she said, addressing Deborah directly, "I have watched the contents of the CD, and I am disgusted. You have misled this court in an attempt to gain financially from this divorce. Your actions have been deceitful and reprehensible." Deborah looked down at her hands, unable to meet the judge's gaze. I felt a sense of vindication, but also a strange sadness. This was the woman I had loved, the woman I had built a life with, and now she was nothing more than a stranger to me. The judge's ruling was harsh. She awarded me 94% of the marital assets, leaving Deborah with just 6%. She ordered Deborah to pay back the alimony I had already given her and left her responsible for all legal fees. Deborah would be allowed to keep the house for 5 years, but after that, it would be sold and I would get 75% of the proceeds. The ruling was more than I had expected, but it felt justified. As I walked out of the courtroom, I saw Betty waiting for me in the hallway, holding Emily. She smiled when she saw me, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. We had won. The nightmare was over. That night, Betty and I took our lawyers out to dinner to celebrate. It was a small victory in the grand scheme of things, but it felt like the first step toward reclaiming our lives. Betty, always practical, suggested we let things cool off for a few days before making any big decisions. I agreed, though I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief that this chapter was finally coming to a close. As we sat there, sipping our wine and talking about the future, I realized how far we had come. We had been through hell together, but now, standing on the other side, I could see a future that was brighter than I had ever imagined. Final resolution. The months following the trial flew by, and life began to settle into a new rhythm. With the weight of the divorce lifted from my shoulders, I was able to focus on what truly mattered: Betty and little Emily. I had never anticipated forming such a bond with them, but as we navigated the challenges of new parenthood together, our relationship deepened in ways I hadn't imagined. Betty's strength shone through during those months. She managed to juggle the demands of being a new mother while still working from home, often with Emily strapped to her chest. I became her partner in every sense of the word, helping with the baby while she finished her projects. We shared late-night feedings and diaper changes, turning those exhausting moments into laughter and shared stories. As the weeks passed, we moved into a comfortable routine. I found joy in the simplest moments, watching Emily take her first steps, hearing her laughter, and seeing the way she lit up when Betty walked into a room. I had come to love that little girl, as if she were my own. But it was my relationship with Betty that really began to flourish. We had both been through the ringer, and we understood each other in ways most couples didn't. One evening, after a long day of work and parenting, I caught her gaze as we sat on the couch. She smiled softly, and in that moment, I knew I wanted to take the next step. "Betty," I began, my heart racing, "I want you to know how much you mean to me. You've been my rock through all of this. I never expected to find someone like you, especially after everything we went through." She looked at me, her expression serious yet warm. "I feel the same way, Cole. You've been so good to me and to Emily. I don't think I could have done this without you." The air between us crackled with a mix of tension and affection. It felt like the right moment, the culmination of everything we had shared. "I want to be with you, truly, not just as friends or co-parents, but as partners. I want us to be a family." Her eyes lit up, and she nodded slowly. "I've been hoping you'd say that. I want that too." From that moment, we made it official. We became a family, not just in name but in every sense of the word. We laughed, we cried, and we supported each other as we embraced this new life together. I found myself falling for Betty in ways I hadn't expected, and I knew she felt the same. As time went on, I became more involved in Emily's life. I attended her first birthday party, filled with laughter and joy. Friends and family gathered to celebrate, and I couldn't help but feel grateful for the unexpected turns my life had taken. One afternoon, as we sat in the backyard watching Emily play, I turned to Betty and took her hand. I never thought I could find happiness again after my marriage fell apart. But here I am, and it's all because of you. Betty smiled, her eyes glistening with emotion. "We've both come a long way, Cole. I'm so glad we found each other." In that moment, I realized that the pain of betrayal had led us to something beautiful. We had built a life together, and it was just the beginning. I knew we would face challenges ahead, but with Betty by my side, I felt ready to tackle anything. Together, we would navigate the ups and downs of life, hand in hand, forging our own path forward as a family.